Good evening, everyone. I'm Shannon Breen. This is Fox News Tonight. The controversy over President Trump's condolence call to the widow of a soldier recently killed in an attack in Niger isn't going away, with the left even now playing the race card on this issue. For details on the developing story, all the latest, let's check in with Chief National Correspondent Ed Henry. Good evening, Ed.
Shannon, great to see you. You know, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly yesterday really tried to end this ugly back and forth with that emotional, really remarkable defense of President Trump and his phone call to the widow of a slain Army soldier. But in the last 24 hours, this has only gotten uglier, with a Democratic Congresswoman and others now injecting race into this controversy. Today, Sarah Sanders at the White House podium declared to a reporter it was, quote, highly inappropriate to challenge a four-star Marine general like John Kelly on this issue. Kelly had spent 18 minutes Thursday describing the heartbreaking procedure for notifying families that their loved ones have been killed in action by bravely recounting how he found out how his own son, Lieutenant Robert Kelly, had been killed in 2010. Somehow, that has led various people on the left to start attacking John Kelly. And in fact, a former aide to Hillary Clinton, one of her spokespeople, actually jumped in on this. Brian Fallon tweeting, quote, Kelly isn't just an enabler of Trump, he's a believer in him. That makes him as odious as the rest. Don't be distracted by the uniform. Then Fallon retweeted this from the liberal group Planned Parenthood, quote, this is part of a pattern of the Trump administration attacking and undermining black women. It's despicable. We stand with @Rep Wilson and all black women. Now, tonight, the Congresswoman is going much further, charging, quote, the White House itself is full of white supremacists, adding in this New York Times interview that some people in the White House are racially biased by saying they're making themselves look like fools. They have no credibility. Now, the Congresswoman was also charging General Kelly used a racist term, empty barrel, when he claimed she tried to hog the credit for getting the money for an FBI building in her home state of Florida a couple of years ago. Here's what General Kelly said.
And a Congresswoman stood up, and in the long tradition of empty barrels making the most noise, stood up there and all of that and talked about how she was instrumental in getting the funding for that building. Even for someone that is that empty a barrel, we were stunned.
Now, after a video of that 2015 speech emerged showing Wilson did not talk about the funding, White House aides clarified that the Congresswoman made other comments that day, in their words, grandstanding about what she had accomplished. Interesting. Now, the Congresswoman has now spoken out and said that the White House is monitoring her words so closely that she's going to have to tell her children she's a rock star. Shannon?
All right, Ed Henry live for us tonight. Thank you from the White House. You too. All right, we have heard that General Kelly called Congresswoman Wilson a, quote, empty barrel. Well, apparently, Congresswoman Wilson says that that is a racial term, or at least has racial overtones.
Empty barrels make the most noise. And he was using that, he was likening that to you. Basically, that you're
I think that's a racist term, too. I'm thinking about that when we looked it up in the dictionary, because I had never heard of an empty barrel. And I don't like to be dragged into something like that.
Joining us now for reaction, Bruce Lavelle, who is the executive director of the National Diversity Coalition for Trump, and Scott Bolden, the Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, thanks, Scott, I'll start with you. Have you heard that term before? Because I went around and did a little digging, too. Some people attribute it to Plato, some to Shakespeare. But a lot of people feel like when there's an ugly dust-up like this, people go to race as the issue. Do you think this is an issue about race?
Well, race plays a factor in so many parts of our daily lives, whether we want to admit that or not, primarily with people of color as opposed to others. That being said, I don't know whether it's a racist term or not. It would be new in my vernacular, if you will, but let's just say this. It was certainly an offensive term, and one in which had no real basis. Even if you disagreed with Congresswoman Wilson, the name-calling coming out of the White House, empty barrel, wacky, and what have you, really has no place in our dialogue about this. Remember, we got 4 dead soldiers, and we're, you know, they're underneath all of this. And then in the top screen, you have the president and Kelly and Wilson going back and forth with the name calling, with the accusations, with the lies. We got videos and what have you. And we don't even know why our men were in Niger and how they died, why 2 were left over. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's disgusting and sad. And I don't think the name calling helps anything at all. I think both sides bear some responsibility. But the reality is this White House and Kelly and Trump, they drive this narrative. They love to fight, and they're driving the narrative of name calling and what have you to a sitting congressman. Why is she an empty barrel? It's offensive because there's no depth or substance, at least allegedly. But why is she an empty barrel? Simply because they disagree with her. She happens to be African American. You're going to take your cues from that, or most people will.
Well, and Bruce, today she actually said in an interview with the New York Times that the White House is full of white supremacists.
Oh, wow. You know, it's so sad, Shannon, and thanks for having me. You know, unfortunately, I've been dealing with this race mess all the way since 2015. The Democrat Party is failing. The CBC is special interests and lobbyists backed. They have no plan. Their DNC is in shambles. They're $3.5 million in debt. They have no policy. Every time they get pushed up against the wall, the only thing they can come up is race. The unfortunate part of it is, you know, I was thinking about this empty barrel deal. My dad, who's a retired command sergeant major, he actually made a comment to me one time in high school about, you ain't talking about nothing, you like an empty barrel. My dad is African American, newsflash. So to take this and to drive it into something that's race, it's typical of the Democrat Party now is to come out with this narrative to paint everyone that's a racist, that the president's racist, John Kelly. You know, this is drama. The other thing too, I actually got to meet General Kelly 3 weeks ago at the West Wing, and I got to talk to him. I told my dad is, you know, retired sergeant major. My uncle served in Vietnam twice, like my daddy served twice in Vietnam. My uncles all served. They're all master sergeants. I grew up in Fort Hood. I grew up in a military rich family. I've been to funerals where these soldiers are laid under flags. My dad's fallen comrade coming back to Fort Hood, going to a funeral as a little boy with the gun salutes and all the things and all the family crying because he had a friend that lost his life. Let me tell you something. General Kelly, what everyone didn't really talk about is he made reference that he went over to Arlington National Cemetery to get a reflection. He was so upset. What people don't realize is that how hurtful that is to try to paint a narrative to make this general who has to send other soldiers over, you make decisions that these soldiers die and his own son to die. You know,
Bruce,
it's typical
with the racism issue. What does that have to do with the racism issue?
Sir,
and the
it's
fact
only
that
racism.
Trump traffics in racism, which is offensive generally. I don't know about the empty barrel, but it's certainly an offensive term generally. And if you make it against someone who's black or brown,
it's not.
Going to lend itself to the race question, whether it's real or not real.
You guys call the sky is falling racism. You guys call the sky as racism. You guys have the Democrat Party is failing.
I call racism,
and let's note that they're not part of the White House anymore.
They're not part of the
White House, and so they have moved on. But Bruce, let me ask you this: were you encouraged by what Scott had to say, and that he said both sides bear some responsibility in this conversation? And the most important thing for everyone is that we have 4 grieving families right now. Do you think it's fair to say that both sides have added to this conversation and this thing ratcheting up to where it is now?
All I know, unfortunately, is we have some gentlemen that went home to the Lord that lost their lives in battle, who will lay under that flag, who have fought for me to sit on this show and to be where I'm at as a black business owner here in Atlanta, and all the freedoms that we cherish so much is because of that gentleman that lost his life, and General Kelly who served, and my father, and my uncles, and everything else. The president made reference that he called the folks, the families, and he was I know the president of the United States, ladies and gentlemen. He is a good man. Remember now, he signed that executive order to let veterans, for the first time in the history of the United States, choose another hospital. As candidate Trump, before he was President Trump, he raised $5 million for veterans as a candidate. The list goes on.
Yeah, Bruce, I want to make sure that we
So the
bring Scott back in
passion
here.
runs deep.
Yeah,
the passion runs deep.
Is it possible, Scott, that what the president was saying, his remarks about this young man, this gentleman knew what he was choosing, was meant as a compliment to say, we don't have a draft now. Everybody who signs up, these are people who are selfless. There are heroes because they know what they potentially are walking into. Do you think that's potentially been misinterpreted in this?
The reality is this. Donald Trump can be both. He can both traffic in racism, but he can be very patriotic, if you will. Now, how the family processed and what they heard from Donald Trump and compared to what Donald Trump said and what he meant, they could both be right. I'm sure he was rather clumsy with it because Donald Trump doesn't have a history of servant leadership or a history of consoling. He cares about money, his development properties, and his family.
But do you not think that he cares about fallen soldiers as commander-in-chief?
So
because he did reach out to General Kelly, who we all know lost his son and has now had to relive that publicly because of this conversation we're having, and said to General Kelly, how do I make these phone calls?
But he forced that issue, and then he politicized Kelly's death of his own son by forcing his chief of staff out there to relive and talk about something painful.
I don't think anybody forces General Kelly to do that.
You don't force the general.
Let me just tell you this, okay?
No,
he's part of the White House. He's the chief of staff, and if he did it on his own, fine. But let me just say this to you. Donald Trump, whether he said what he said clumsily or not, right? The reality is, if the family processed it that way, certainly there should have been a follow-up call to explain, because both could be right and both sides could be wrong. But why are we driving this narrative with name-calling and lies and bringing Kelly out and so forth and so on? That's not making him look good, whether it's a race issue or not. In fact, it's making him look like he's on the ground fighting when he's the president, and he ought to be presidential and consoler-in-chief. He continues to fail in these important areas, but he has no record of it. And so I don't get it. I don't let him off the hook with it, Shannon. What I think is both sides could have misunderstood. Both sides probably ought to be talking, but they ought to stop driving this narrative of negativity. Yeah. That's what's wrong with this country, and that's what you get with a Trump White House.
Well, all right, Bruce, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, because I know a lot of people think that there's gasoline coming onto the fire from both ends of this. I mean, is it better? Is it an idea that these parties to this have another private conversation where the president could have a chance to console or clarify in a different way? Or do you think that it's been
non-disclosure agreement.
Right? Or do you think it's been so politicized at this point, Bruce, that there's just no way to wrap it up civilly?
Well, you know, all this drama started with Congressman Wilson, and I have been through this many times as excuse me, I didn't cut you off, sir. I didn't. Excuse me.
You know it.
Excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. I didn't interrupt you. Okay, fix the failing DNC party. Listen. Congressman Wilson.
Focus. All right, let's focus on the task.
It is what it is. Congressman Wilson should spend more time in her district with a very extremely high unemployment rate and concentrate on trying to bring jobs back to her district instead of making up this false narrative on the president. I don't know what her motive is or what she's trying to do, but it's doing a disservice to her district with a 16+% unemployment rate, with over 600,000 residents, with a predominantly African-American district, which, by the way, President Trump, in his tenure, since he's been president, we have the highest unemployment rate for African Americans. Also, newsflash, he has the highest African-American vote since Richard Nixon and climbing. So you guys keep this up. We're going to double it in 2020 because if you guys don't get a plan together, the whole DNC is just going to totally fall off the cliff.
Yeah, you're way off subject. She's a hero in her community.
No, I'm not off subject.
And working hard on all those
because if you're a congressperson,
come on now,
we've gotten off topic.
You need to be concentrating on your constituents.
I'm going to ask you both to go a little kumbaya on me now because we're out of time. And again, I think that the good thing is that we all agree and we do recognize that the most important thing here are those 4 grieving families. Congress is going to be fighting to get answers. The defense secretary was on the Hill today. We'll talk more about that coming up because that is the most important thing. Bruce and Scott, thank you both very much.
All right. Thanks.
Up next, you will not believe what Nancy Pelosi is saying about the President Trump and Dreamers. We're going to have a live report and let you weigh in directly ahead. Last month, the Trump administration announced it was phasing out DACA, President Obama's program that protected illegal immigrants brought to the U.S. as children from being deported. President Trump says he's willing to sign legislation to protect the so-called Dreamers, so long as the bill includes a whole lot of other things, several tough border security measures and many others. The president has had some productive talks with Democrats on the issue, but House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi didn't sound too positive on The View today.
There was never a deal. The only agreement was he would support the DREAM Act. We would work with him on some border issues. We have a responsibility to protect our border. We don't have a responsibility to turn on have the Dreamers start a reign of terror in our country by their going after their families and other people.
Joining us now for reaction, Dr. Gina Loudon, a TV and radio host, and Capri Cafaro, who is executive in residence at American University School of Public Affairs. Good to see you both.
Absolutely. Good evening. Good to be with you.
All right, coming to us from Florida down there. I'm a little jealous, but it is a nice night here in D.C. too. All right, Capri, let's start with this. Okay, so the House Minority Leader said that it's basically going to be unleashing a reign of terror if the president does not step in on this. You know, they had this little dinner. She and Senate Minority Leader, like, you know, Chuck Schumer was over there. And when he came out and they came out and said basically there was a deal, the right freaked out. So the president has now said, like, okay, we'll do a deal on Dreamers, but here are the 70 things I'm going to need from you, including the border wall. So where do we go from here?
You know, I think that there's a number of provisions, in my understanding, that we actually, Democrats and Republicans, can come together. For example, E-Verify. And actually, the issue of the wall apparently was something that Democrats were actually talking about back in 2013. So, you know, if you're focusing on some of those things as opposed to, you know, ripping families apart, I think there's concern about, for example, what may happen as far as cracking down on unaccompanied minors, for example. I think that is where Nancy Pelosi is using quite inflammatory language, mind you, but I think that's where the reign of terror is coming in. We need to take that rhetoric aside and actually focus on the areas that we can agree on, because if we really do care, you know, there are deadlines in place. We need to work together to figure out the places where we can come together and then build upon that for comprehensive immigration reform.
And so people understand, when you talk about E-Verify, this is essentially in a system that would require employers who employ people to make sure that they're legit, they have Social Security numbers that check out, and those kinds of things.
Everybody can agree on that. I mean, at the end of the day, employers, if they are the ones that are creating the demand for undocumented individuals, because if they're not going to employ these folks, and maybe they're employing them because they don't want to pay withholding taxes, I say one of the great ways, if we want to raise money, let's actually, you know, find these folks the withholding for Medicare, for Social Security, you know, for workers' comp. What a great way, you know, to crack down on the demand for undocumented and actually put some money back into the coffers for things like Social Security.
All right, so Dr. Gina, when we talk about the fact that there could be some middle ground on some of these issues, we know there are many issues in which there is no agreement, because when the president just a couple of weeks ago came out with his list, like, yes, we give you the so-called Dreamers, we protect them, but here are all the other things that we want. Chuck and Nancy, as you know, they're affectionately called, essentially said this is a complete non-starter. There is no way. So now we have her on ABC Today talking about, quote, reign of terror. How do the sides get together here in Washington to get anything done that's just not more inflammatory, just like we talked about in our last block of the show?
I'm so glad that both of you have framed this up the way you have, and that Chuck and Nancy thing always reminds me of, I don't know, a childhood cartoon I watched or something. But I think Capri's words are a breath of fresh air. I love when I hear Democrats talking about just really logical negotiations that can take place the way that politics is supposed to function. Unfortunately, I don't hear that a lot out of other Democrats, such as Nancy Pelosi, using inflammatory language. You know, I feel like their playbook is first call them racist, like you talked about in your first segment tonight, Shannon. But then if that doesn't work, just go ahead and use some sort of scare tactic like reign of terror. We're not talking about a reign of terror. As Capri pointed to, and you did as well, there's a lot to agree upon here. There's a lot of good that can be done for America. And you know what? After Vegas and everything we've been through recently, Shannon, I think that Americans deserve to put aside the rhetoric and talk about what we can do that's productive and constructive for America.
Okay, so with that in mind, Capri, this is also interesting to me that in this same appearance where the House Minority Leader talked about the reign of terror, she also said these things. She says, I have confidence that President Trump will not walk away from his support for the Dreamers.
Right.
So is it support for the Dreamers, or is it reign of terror for the Dreamers? I'm confused.
You know, you and me both. And I think maybe what this is some rhetoric out of Leader Pelosi. I mean, remember, just a few weeks ago, out in San Francisco, Francisco, in her district, she was actually getting shouted down by folks that, were immigrants, saying, we absolutely, you're not doing enough.
Right.
So I think on one hand, I think maybe she's trying to placate some of the more extreme elements of the base or of this group. And at the same time, I think maybe, sending a single signal to the White House to say, we're still willing to play ball. So, a lot of this goes on behind closed doors. I can tell you, I was the minority leader in the Ohio Senate as well for a number of years. And, sometimes what is presented publicly is not necessarily what's happening in negotiations behind closed doors, for better or worse.
Yeah, and Dr. Dina, that's just the way a lot of Washington works, and the way a lot of this gets done is that you have secret back channel things going on. We find out often, I hear around the Hill, that there are bipartisan conversations going on. Weeks ago on things like tax reform and all kinds of other issues, even on immigration, there are groups working together. But publicly, there's this rhetoric that heats up and inflames the most, diverse sides of this conversation. And I don't know that it gets us any closer to a solution when it comes time to vote.
Right, I agree with you. And I don't think, especially the inflammatory language, the use of words like terror, when we have real terrorist threats in this country, President Trump is certainly not a terrorist threat, nor are any of his policies. So I think when we use words like that, when we refer back to the identity politics, these are the things that rip apart the fiber of America. And I believe in the last election, that's what Americans voted against. I believe, yes, they voted for a president who they knew would be willing to lead. And I think from the Republicans' perspective and perhaps for the Trump base, they can know that this president is probably going to negotiate hardcore and come away with something. That's something Republicans haven't been able to look forward to in the last several administrations. It's pretty much been whatever the Democrats demand and the Republicans were just going to kind of fold. I don't think we'll see that under this president's leadership. And I think that we do have a real chance to come to some strongly negotiated good things for this country under this president and with this leadership.
Quickly, do you think we actually get there on some of these things?
I do, and honestly, for the sake of the dreamers, for the sake of their families, and for the sake of America, I certainly hope that that's the case. And as we're up against a March deadline, and I think that Americans writ large want to see cooperation. The base and inside the Beltway politics, maybe they don't want to see cooperation. They see it's a dirty word. I can tell you the lion's share of Americans want to see people come together for real solutions.
They do on any number of topics, and immigration is just one of them. All right, Capri, Gina, thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Up next, a major ruling in a case. It's got an illegal immigrant in U.S. custody, a minor now seeking to force the federal government to allow her to have an abortion. It's got many hot topics, and we've got the details. A debate right after this quick break. Some breaking news tonight. A pregnant illegal immigrant teen in U.S. custody in Texas trying to force the federal government to facilitate her to have an abortion. Just tonight, the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals, this is one step below the Supreme Court, ordered the federal government by October 31st to find a government-approved sponsor who then will take custody of the teen, and then, if she wants to, they'll help facilitate the abortion. If the feds do not do that, the case will go back to a lower court judge who's already ruled she should be able to get the abortion. In other words, the illegal immigrant teen is very likely to get the abortion right here in the U.S. unless the Supreme Court maybe gets involved. So joining us now to talk about that and more, Penny Nance, CEO and president of Concerned Women for America, and Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. Good to see you both tonight.
Great to be with you.
Let me just ask you, Elizabeth, as our resident legal eagle who has had many cases before the Supreme Court you've been involved with, what are the odds you think this ends up there?
Well, I think if it were to get to the Supreme Court, I mean, this is really an extraordinary case where we even had some people suggesting, fortunately not the Trump administration, that undocumented immigrants don't even get the constitutional protections of people in the United States. That's breathtakingly wrong and unconstitutional. And we have a case here of the Trump administration really putting what the Supreme Court would term a substantial obstacle in the way of this young woman's constitutional right to choose whether or not to have an abortion. She has complied with Texas law. She's within the period in which she's allowed under Texas law to get an abortion, although if there's a further delay, she might move out of that period, which is why time is so of the essence here. And I think if we get this case up to the Supreme Court, we'll see another ruling like we saw just in the, actually coming out of Texas in the most recent terms, where the Supreme Court reaffirmed that a woman has a constitutional right based in her dignity and personal liberty and reproductive autonomy to determine for herself herself whether to choose to have an abortion or to choose to carry a pregnancy to term.
Well, and Penny, I know a lot of pro-life groups are worried about a precedent this potentially could set. And a couple of folks I talked with yesterday said they don't want this to be a magnet to pull young women across the border. If maybe where they're from they couldn't get an abortion, but come to the U.S. and feel like there's going to be a protection, a legal ruling or protection that would allow them to come here to get an abortion they couldn't get at home. But it's interesting, in this ruling from the D.C. Circuit today, they said, we note the government has assumed for purposes of this case that the young woman, 17 years old, an unlawful immigrant who was apparently detained shortly after unlawfully crossing into the U.S., does possess a constitutional right to obtain an abortion in the U.S. Is that already setting that precedent?
Well, that's the concern. But can I just back up for one moment and recognize what we're talking about? This young woman is 15 weeks along in her pregnancy. That means that this baby has all her major organs. She has eyes and she has eyelids. She has ears. She can even hear her mother's voice. We can even see a baby at that stage sucking its thumb on a sonogram. This is a fully formed baby girl or boy, and there's two patients here. There's two people that crossed that border, and this young woman came unlawfully into our country and is asking our country to facilitate her abortion. The vast majority of people in this country do not want to burden their conscience, nor most people in Texas, with someone else's abortion. So we are very concerned that this sets a precedent in which people from around the world will come to our country in order to seek an abortion. In Texas, the Attorney General filed an amicus saying that they were concerned about Texas becoming, a magnet for people to come across the border for abortion. So that's a deep concern.
Okay, I want to read something that we got tonight. This is an official statement from Health and Human Services, the Administration for Children and Families, and essentially they oversee the care of these undocumented minors who come to the country illegally one way or another. And she's in a federally funded shelter that's watching over her because she's not of age. They say for however much time we're given, the Office of Refugee Resettlement and HHS, the ones that are tasked with watching over her, will protect the well-being of this minor and all children and their babies in our facilities, and we will defend human dignity for all in our care. I mean, Elizabeth, it seems that that's where we break then, the two sides breaking on what is dignity and care for this 17-year-old.
Well, the Supreme Court and the Constitution have already decided that. And I absolutely respect that there are people who think that it should be different and for moral or personal reasons, reasons of conscience might wish that it were otherwise, but that simply is not the case. She is 15 weeks along, but she has a constitutional right. She has the right under Texas law. And taxpayers are not going to pay for this abortion. I think that's a misstatement of the facts that has been out there a lot. Because it's undisputed in the court, that was in the court's ruling today, that the lawyers for this young woman will pay for the abortion, will transport there herself, and the government doesn't have the constitutional authority to force you to have an abortion or to force you to keep a baby.
They still have to care for her after this is all done. She is in the federal care of HHS. The Trump administration and the majority of American people do not want entangled with someone else's abortion, do not want to burden our conscience and using our tax dollars. If you were in the Bureau of
Prisons, you could get an abortion. They're punishing her because she's an undocumented immigrant.
She does not have to stay.
The Constitution doesn't require you to give up your constitutional rights.
She is not a U.S. citizen.
And
she's here illegally, and she can go home.
How much do you think this has to do with the
Constitution works?
How much do you think this has to do with the fact that she is 17 years old too? Because I mean, she's young, and we know that under Texas law, she would have to either get parental consent or she would have to get a court order. And they say she got the court order when she was 9 weeks along. So Penny, now if we go to the October 31st deadline the court set today for finding a sponsor who will walk her through this process, her legal team says, she's going to be 16 and a half weeks then, and it's a different procedure. And of course, the child is much further along, so it becomes that much more controversial for people.
That's right. And she came into this country unlawfully. She was offered the idea of going back home. They were going to expedite her departure, and she has said no, that she wants to be here. And the ACLU is working to set precedent. This is new law. Casey doubled down on the idea that it's different when we're talking about minors, and parents need to be involved in these decisions, these important, life-changing decisions for not one person but two people. And that's the important point here, that this is not just about one person. This is about two people that cross the border into our country.
What about this issue of finding a sponsor now? Because I heard from both sides today who were upset about the decision. We talked about this a little bit beforehand, because we had the pro-choice group saying she shouldn't be delayed while they find a sponsor by October 31st. The other side saying they're going to find a sponsor by October 31st. 31st, and she's still going to have the abortion. So, I mean, Elizabeth, where do you stand on this issue of finding her a sponsor? Because that person, they said they haven't been able to find a blood relative for her, but it's now going to be somebody on this side of the border who takes responsibility for what happens to her next.
I think that that's really important to put this in context when we think about that. This young woman came through treacherous conditions to the United States, fleeing abuse and persecution.
We don't know
and
that.
That is what she is claiming, and we have legal processes to go through to determine that. She has the legal right to seek asylum and refugee here. And, certainly if she cannot seek refuge here, then she will be deported. But she has the right to seek that, and you can't ask her to give up that legal right, which she clearly has under the law, in order to exercise her constitutional rights. And while the information is kept private because she is a minor, we do know that the country to which she would be sent back does not allow abortion. So essentially, the Trump administration is forcing her either by keeping her in custody here or sending her back to a place where she could face abuse and persecution in order to force her to have a pregnancy.
Quick final word.
Well, they have offered the idea to expedite, to send her home and allow her to deal with this in her home country. U.S. citizens should not have to foot the bill. In some way, there will be entanglement. There is entanglement because she has to be cared for before and after the procedure, and she is in our custody. Our country wants to care for and use compassion and not end life.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to leave you with your agree to disagree. But Penny and Elizabeth, great to have both of you with us.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much. Tough topic. All right. Up next, our experts break down the biggest political stories of the week. Are they the ones you've got your eyes on? Stay with us. Welcome back. It has been a roller coaster week in Washington. To find out what the biggest stories were, let's bring in two top reporters working in our nation's capital. Aaron McPike, White House correspondent for the Independent Journal Review, and Philip Wegman, writer for the Washington Examiner. Good to see you both.
You too.
All right. We all kind of have at the top of the list this whole dispute. General Kelly, himself a part of a Gold Star family, the president, the congresswoman. Philip, where does this go from here?
Well, the White House definitely needed a champion in this culture war, and I think they found one in Chief of Staff Kelly. I mean, when he stepped behind that podium and he talked not just as a chief of staff, but as a father who got that phone call himself, not only did he win points with his own base, but I think in the White House press pool, I think he captured their attention and he changed the narrative. We're going to see a lot more of General Kelly.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he wants to be seen. I mean, I think he's more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, but it was powerful to have him out there.
He has a ton of credibility, and I think that was really important, and he absolutely dominated the week. Now, there were some problems with what he said, too, and that will go into the next week for sure, because what he said, that Frederica Wilson said about that FBI building dedication wasn't completely accurate. But I do think for much of what he did, I guess it was Tuesday that he came out and talked, maybe it was Wednesday,
I think.
He gave a civics lesson, and that was really important, and I think that's actually a really good piece of what's going on with the Trump administration right now. We are teaching the American public about what goes on behind closed doors in the government, and that's important.
Yeah, and I think for him to have the perspective, he speaks with full authority on this issue of losing a child, and it's not something I think that he enjoys speaking about publicly. No. So I think that was a very bold decision on his part to say, I'm willing to reopen my family to having to relive this, to try to settle and explain for the American people what the president maybe not perfectly, but what he was trying to do. But it seems that there's always another tweet, another interview, especially after the congresswoman said, my understanding was yesterday she wasn't going to talk about it anymore. Then I got up and she's on another network talking about it this morning. So the story has legs, and in that I think we'll talk about more about the underlying investigation as to what happened to these men, because that's critically important. Okay, some other top stories that you have. John, you had another one saying that the FCC commissioner is defending the First Amendment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is one of the more important but less focused on topics this week. I mean, President Trump has been flirting with censoring the press, and this week in those tweets he kind of batted his eyes at the idea of the Fairness Doctrine, and then the FCC chairman, he just completely shut that down, and he shut it down in a really important and smart way. He talked about legal precedent and the First Amendment, and so he didn't even actually mention Trump, and so by being low-key, I think he was very strategic, and he was able to dismiss and disarm that situation, hopefully.
And Aaron, you're also pointing to the opioid investigation.
Right. So CBS and Washington Post did this joint investigation, but what came out of it was that Tom Marino, the Pennsylvania Republican who President Trump had nominated to be his drug czar, actually had to withdraw that nomination because there was so much criticism about the donations that he had gotten from the drug industry and helping see through this bill in Congress that made it actually easier for people to have access to opioids. But in general, the opioid story continues to dominate. It's such an important story. It impacts so many people across the country.
Yeah, and I think more and more we're all experiencing personally, and people close to us, that this is something that we heard about it for a couple of years, and now it is really hitting home for a lot of people in a very personal way, and something that at least has bipartisan agreement needs to be fully attacked head on. So it's nice to see when Washington agrees on something. Okay, so let's also talk about yet another Republican congressman stepping away.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of these congressmen just quitting Congress early. Now we have Pat Tiberi. He's a guy who's been in Congress for 17 years, and he comes from a deep red district. He could have kept his career going in the House for as long as he wanted, but this is something that we saw with Senator Corker, earlier on with Chaffetz. I think this is a mix of Republicans being shell-shocked and also a bit of malaise. They're tired of these internal conflicts with the party and then not actually winning anything in the majority.
And when you see all these retirements, it generally suggests that there could certainly be a flip. You saw this with Democrats going into 2010. A number of Democrats retired, and then the House flipped. We saw it in 2006 as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and with midterms, they usually go against that president who's in his first term in the White House, against his party. So, man, it's going to be an exciting year next year for all of us political wonkies. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yes.
All right, now also we have the issue of the budget passing the Senate. So I would say it is something getting done in Washington, but it wasn't done on a bipartisan basis, Erin.
It was not. And it was kind of ceremonial, but they had to do it in order to move ahead with tax reform. So you have to call it a big story because they did get it done. And remember, the budget didn't pass for a number of years until the last several. So it was a big thing that they finally got done.
Yeah, but it now, Philip, opens the doors to the next big process, which is tax reform. By the way, do you think that there will, because we've been hearing behind the scenes that there are bipartisan conversations going on, do you think when we actually get to tax reform, the tax cut, whatever they want to call it, because they're managing expectations, that there will be bipartisan buy-in to some kind of package?
Well, that has to be the hope of Majority Leader McConnell. Look, they made clear the way for tax reform with that budget. It was symbolic, and now they actually need to get something on paper, and they need to do it now so that come November and December, they're not relitigating some of these same fights, because we could see Collins and we could see Rand Paul blow this up then. They want to get that done now rather than later.
They might get Heidi Heitkamp. They might get Joe Manchin. They might get Joe Donnelly. I think they're definitely, there's some room to get those three. And also, we heard Paul Ryan say this morning that he wants to have that fourth tax bracket at the upper echelon for top earners, which takes away a Democratic talking point, at least in part.
Yeah. All right. Guys, we love you so much. We want you to stick around. Erin and Philip, right now, we're going to have to take a short break. But when we come back, we're going to talk to these guys a little bit more about a preview of next week's biggest stories. It's Friday night. You need to know. So stay with us. Welcome back. We are rejoined by Erin McPike and Philip Wegman for their predictions of the biggest stories of next week. Okay, so let's start with this one that bounces off a lot of what we've already talked about tonight. And Erin, that is looking into Niger. Why are we there? What happened? What happened to these men? We saw the defense secretary all over Capitol Hill today answering questions for senators, and there have got to be a lot more public answers coming.
And the defense secretary didn't really want to talk to reporters about this. They are not ready, which actually is just going to make this story go further. I would say AFRICOM put out a very long statement through the Pentagon earlier today explaining why it is that the U.S. is in Niger. And it's basically that we're trying to help local forces with the terrorist threats that are happening throughout the entire continent. And that's why they're in certain countries like this. But again, you're hearing a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle say, what went wrong here? Why are we doing this? Just what happened?
Yeah, and Philip, it was interesting to me. I think it was Senator Graham who said this doesn't mean we'll be doing less there. It actually means we may be doing more.
Absolutely. They're going to be looking into this continent. This is something that we haven't focused on because our attention has been in the Middle East, but this is a threat that expands past state lines. And so I think that this is going to be an expansion moving forward. Congress is going to have to take a much closer look as those investigations unfold.
And you think we're going to see more of General Kelly, too?
I think so, absolutely. The civics lesson is going to continue into next week. General Kelly is an asset that the White House, I think they're going to tap more. But one thing that was interesting today was Sarah Huckabee Sanders said that the general, it was insulting to question some of the things that he said and some of the things he actually did get wrong. But in fact, it's actually just the opposite. said, it's inherently American to question that authority. And so this is going to be the next chapter of the civics lesson, I think.
She was roundly criticized for that one. That's right.
Yeah, and I think that we got an update from her tonight. She said, of course, everyone can be questioned, but after witnessing General Kelly's heartfelt and somber account, we should all be able to agree that impugning his credibility on how best to honor fallen heroes is not appropriate, which she issued in response to people saying, yeah, you should be able to question any four-star general or anyone else. That is part of the American experience. Right. All right, both of you think that we're going to hear about more details on tax reform and the contours of that. You mentioned 3 of the Democrats who may be willing to talk and play in this. Where do you think we go next?
Well, for one thing, people haven't seen what this bill looks like. The White House has laid out a couple of top priorities, but this is going to be a 1,000-page bill or so.
At least.
And they are only going to take a couple of weeks, couple of months maybe to get this through. I know we're going to be seeing a number of meetings next week, but I think they're going to start coming out into the public, having hearings, laying out more and more details so we can finally see what this bill is going to have.
And quickly, Philip, we know the president's going to meet with the GOP senators next week as well.
I think he needs to impart to them a sense of urgency because there's been a lot of procrastination. This is their last chance to get something major done right before they break for the year. So that's going to be the message, I believe.
All right. Thank you both. More Fox News Tonight right after this quick break. And before we go, quick plug to check out my new upcoming show, Fox News at Night. It debuts Monday, October 30th, live at 11 p.m. Eastern, right here on Fox News. We'll be covering inevitable late-breaking news developments, along with giving viewers a recap of the day's big stories that you're not going to get anywhere else. We will be live every night at 11 o'clock, Monday through Friday. Kicks off just 10 days from now. That is it for us tonight. Bill Hemmer will be in this chair Monday night, 10 p.m. Eastern. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Good night from Washington.